Thank you, everybody, for joining us. My name is Jesse Iliff. It is my distinct pleasure to be the executive director of the Severn River Association. And welcome to the first of four scheduled Severnside chats, named, of course, after the famed radio programs held by our former president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Thankfully, we don't have the sorts of problems he had to update the nation about. We don't have a world war or a Great Depression going on the Severn River, but the problems that we do have out there are considerable nonetheless. And we will be talking about those issues and some of the innovative approaches that the Severn River Association is taking to address them here today. Before we get going, I wanted to ask a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, this is intended to be a program that is somewhat casual where people can ask questions, but if you wouldn't mind putting those questions in the chat so that when I get through with the presentation I've prepared, we can go through them in a somewhat orderly fashion. We'd appreciate that. And the second thing is that I encourage you all to tune into the remaining programs that we have scheduled quarterly throughout the rest of the year. And we'll be advertising those on social media and through our newsletter and so forth as we go. And then the last thing is, can you give me a thumbs up or speak up and say whether you can see my screen? It should say Severnside Chats Innovation and Restoration with a picture of a pretty sunset over St. Helena Island. Good, awesome, glad to hear it. Okay. Well, I know a few of the folks here on the call fairly well. Thank you for joining us. But for those that don't, I wanted to give a little bit of an update description of SRA. So the Severn River Association, we have a vision of a thriving Severn River by 2050. We're going to talk about how we're going to be getting there a little bit this morning. Our mission is to connect the people who live, work, and play on the Severn River to restore and protect it for all of our communities. And this program, the Severnside Chats, is our latest and potentially greatest way of trying to connect with the people who live, work, and play on the river. So thank you for joining us. Our values are to be community-centered, data-driven, collaborative, and most of all, we're all passionate about the work that we do. This is our team. You can see myself and Sarah Winchester here on the call today, and Elizabeth Somerset, Ben Fertig, and Molly Boyd round out our merry band. So, what is going on the Severn River? Why do we exist, and what are we trying to fix? You can see here our two most recent report cards that, while not failing, not dead, the river is somewhat sick and could use some help. Going from a C plus in 23 to a C in 24, and that's mostly due to a reduction in dissolved oxygen levels that we read through our monitoring program, which I'm sure many of you already know are often fueled by an excessive amount of nutrients, which drives algal blooms. And then when those algae die, they suck oxygen out of the water. This is a pie chart, side-by-side comparison of Chesapeake Bay's nitrogen sources, one of the key pollutants in the rivers and the bay itself, stacked against the Severn River. And you see, throughout the bay, agriculture is a big deal, 44%, the largest section of nitrogen pollution. Here on the Severn River, we have very little ag, and it's a much smaller slice of the pie, just 4% of our nitrogen coming from ag, but 47%, almost half, is from stormwater. That's the real big deal. But you also see a big difference in the septic system loading in the Severn River, almost a third of our nitrogen coming from septic systems compared to only 6% in the broader Chesapeake Bay, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that in a minute. Now, this is a graph that I stole from UMSES, the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, that shows, it's hard to read the captions because I had to blow it up from a snip that I took online, but it shows overall water quality attainment from 1985 to 2017. So we got a 30-year data set that is represented here. It's a little bit dated, but the green line that I threw through there, by the way, for those of you that are very scientifically minded, that is not an actual trend line. It's just something I slapped on there to give an idea of the main point. And the main point is that water quality has been gradually improving. Here over 30 years, you can see slightly below 30% attainment, coming up to just above 40% attainment. Now, that's good. It's especially impressive when you consider that in 1985, the population of the Bay's watershed was about 10 million people, and now it's about 18. So even holding the line during a doubling of the population is an impressive accomplishment. But I'm sure many of us would have liked to see that improvement accelerated and enhanced, especially when you consider how much money we've spent as a country and how much time has gone into it. And now, when the funding picture from the federal government is questionable about how much investment will be made in the recovery of the Chesapeake Bay, it seems even more appropriate than ever that we be looking to new ways of doing things in hopes of accelerating the Bay's recovery. So, at the Severn River Association, our restoration program is diversified across the upland areas of our watershed and along the shoreline itself and in the water to try and present a holistic river-wide approach that will result in accelerated restoration. In the upland areas, if you recall that pie chart, stormwater is a huge issue, and it's something that we need to be addressing if we're going to help the Severn thrive. Along the shoreline, septic systems, effluent interfaces with the salt water from the tidal part of the river, and it forms a pinch point where it's focused and where we can intercept it and treat it before it reaches the tidal water. And then within the water itself, historically, the Severn River had 23 oyster bars that were identified during the famous Yates survey at the turn of the 20th century. Now there are 4 that have been restored by the Severn River Association in between the 2 bridges that cross the river. There's a couple more out at the mouth, and there's one more by the mouth of Asquith Creek that was restored by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. But suffice it to say, the oyster population is a small fraction of what it used to be, and we need to figure out ways that we can make sure those oysters continue to thrive, continue to filter water, and provide habitat for us. So we're going to, for the rest of the presentation, take these 3 areas in turn. Oh, by the way, if you haven't already gotten one of your fancy SRA tumblers, I hope that you'll go on our website and pick one up. So these pictures show a flooding problem that was occurring in a townhome community in Annapolis called Georgetown East. They had been getting ponding in their common areas of the community and a lot of erosion. It's kind of hard to see in the picture on the left, but the water there is discolored as it flows by that basketball hoop. And that erosion was just going into a storm drain and then pouring into Back Creek, one of the very beleaguered little tributaries in the city of Annapolis. Now, we worked with a couple of contractors to design stormwater infiltration cells that would capture and treat that stormwater, keep it from going straight into the drains. And these pictures show a lot of the plantings that were getting installed in October of 2025 that are intended to soak up that stormwater, punch deep roots into the underlying soils to help it infiltrate and stay clean before it reaches the tidal rivers. This is all fairly standard stormwater management stuff. And here's what it looked like after it was planted. Nice, manicured. Right now, it looks like a big sheet of white ice. By the way, welcome to the thaw, everybody. The Pevensey children have made their way into Narnia, and we're finally escaping the long winter. So huzzah for that. But we are excited about these particular cells here on the left, and I'll tell you why. Because they are basically the same size, and they have this very similar, if not identical, plant plan. And so it was a great way to set up an experiment where one was the experimental cell and one was a control cell. The picture on the right is a third, and there's 4 total in this community that are intended to treat stormwater. 3 of them got the treatment that I'll describe here in a minute. And then there's one that we left alone, just with nice plants, with infiltrative underlying soils, an engineered stormwater practice. So here is the triple treatment that I was describing. You see the plants on the left, and this is before they went in the ground, obviously. In the center is a product called Myco Bliss, which is a powder that has the propagules of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. On the right is a bin filled with those big chunks are balls of soybean chaff that have been inoculated with oyster mushrooms and lion's mane mushrooms. And on top is a bag of biochar. And all of the plants, except for the control cell, were treated with all 3 of these products. So this stuff here, oyster and lion's mane mushrooms, these are edible mushrooms that are farmed. And I found a oyster farm on the Eastern Shore that would give me this waste product from their operation for free. These are saprophytic fungi, which means that they break down dead organic matter, like the wood chips that are included in our stormwater cell. Then they recycle the nutrients from those wood chips back into the soil, make it more bioavailable to the plants. The fungi themselves obviously absorb a ton of water. Everybody who's ever walked around in a forest after a rainstorm understands this concept. They enhance the soil structure and fertility, and they help break down organic stuff. So we will have, ideally, less maintenance to do as leaves collect in these things over the years. The fungi will help break it down and make that the nutrition in those organic materials available to the plants. Another cool little bonus feature is there's a lot of science out there demonstrating that oyster mushrooms in particular are able to degrade petroleum hydrocarbons. So while these are common areas in a townhouse community that don't specifically drain parking lots, there is a good deal of atmospheric deposition from burned hydrocarbons and things like that, that these mushrooms ought to be able to break down and render inert over time. So that's the first layer of treatment. And here's a short video where you will see me here struggling to break this. I mean, I'm not a weak person, but I'm really working to try and break this thing open, and that's important, and you'll see why. So what we're doing here today is breaking up clumps of spent mushroom substrate from the bay mushrooms over on the Eastern Shore, a local mushroom farmer. This is soybean chaff inoculated with the mycelium of oyster mushrooms. And once this has been spread throughout our bioretention facility, it will bond together with the mulch that is going in to absorb more stormwater, hold the mulch together so it doesn't float away, and also use the nutrients that flow into this cell to grow more mushrooms. So the reason that I was saying the toughness of breaking it apart is important is because the mycelium of these mushrooms really stitches together the organic material and makes it less mobile, which is good for maintenance because it means that our maintenance crews over the next 5 years have to do less reshuffling of the mulch that goes down to keep these plants moisturized. And it's also good because it enhances the soil structure over time and allows it to have that interstitial space that will hold more stormwater, which of course is the whole point of this practice. So we're really excited about how that's going to work. The next piece is the biochar here, this little bag. This is just a pound of biochar, okay? But the thing about biochar that's so neat is the incredible surface area that it has. Depending on the way that it's created, and biochar is just organic material that's been basically half burned, so it doesn't render totally out to ash, but it's just basically pure carbon and has huge surface area. So as you see here in my bullet point, between 50 and 500 square meters per gram of this stuff. So that's really important because it helps sequester carbon in the soil. Again, it helps to improve water retention. The whole point of these stormwater cells is to hold water in place on the land. It increases the soil's ability to retain nutrients. And it enhances soil biodiversity because every one of those teeny little nooks and crannies on the biochar provides habitat for various bacteria and fungi to live and stay unexposed to the elements which might otherwise kill them. And that allows the biodiversity to increase within the soil, which helps its structure, helps its water retention, and importantly, helps the roots of the plants. And that's where the third treatment approach comes in most importantly. So what an arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi is a fungus that penetrates plant roots in a symbiotic way, a good, positive, mutually beneficial way. And it helps the plants uptake nutrients. It helps them grow faster and get bigger, which is important because that means that their roots are penetrating more deeply into the soil, so they'll help infiltrate water more quickly. But also, as plants get bigger, they evapotranspirate more moisture, which means they will dry out the stormwater cell more quickly. After all, most of these communities did not sign on to have a pond built in their community. They signed on to have a stormwater infiltration device. And so we need to design practices that absorb a lot of water and then get rid of it as quickly as possible, but in a way that is beneficial to the environment. Not as quickly as gray infrastructure where it just flows into a pipe, but as quickly as possible in a way that sends it back into the air through evapotranspiration or infiltrates it into the soil. And arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi help with both of those by making the plants healthier. The third little square bullet point makes it so that they're more resistant to stressors like drought or transplant shock. And also the mycorrhizal fungi will help with soil aeration and structure because, again, the extent of the plant's roots is increased through the positive association with these types of fungi. So as I mentioned at the top, we have one cell that did not get all of these treatments, and then the others did. So we are going to be able to go out after every significant rainstorm and measure the amount of water that has collected initially, and then the rate of change between the treated stormwater cells and the non-treated ones to be able to quantify how much these approaches are improving the infiltrative and evapotranspirative capacity of our stormwater. And if you'll recall at the top of the presentation, 47% of the nitrogen pollution coming to the Severn is from stormwater. So if these approaches work the way that we expect they will, we hope that they will become common practice amongst all parties that are working on restoration of the Severn River, and they certainly will become the modus operandi of Severn River Association, because we know that we need to be accelerating the recovery of our river. And if we can provide an example for others to follow that will become a force multiplier throughout the bay, well, that's just an added bonus for us. So let's move to the shoreline. Oh, I'm sorry, wait, I do have one other video. I wanted to show the mechanics of how this works. It's really simple. You saw the first video with the mushroom substrate, how that gets put into the cell. You break this stuff up, you spread it out and mix it with the mulch. For the biochar and the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, the approach is actually pretty easy also. There's no sound on this video, so don't be worried if you don't hear anything, but this is our Chesapeake Conservation Corps member, Erin Hamner, treating the plants before they get planted. You can see she's got a tablespoon measuring. This is just the instructions on the back of the bag for the MycoBliss product. And she had already done the biochar in the same way. Just a tiny amount is enough to make a really big difference with the plants. All right, moving to the shoreline. Now, you'll recall the pie chart at the beginning, the huge amount of nitrogen pollution we have in the Severn River from septic systems, almost a third. On the right is a picture, a snip from a document that Anne Arundel County sent me that shows the approximate location of every septic system in every waterfront community on the Severn River. This is Harold Harbor, and the septic systems are the little green dots, and the red lines are where the county's modeling anticipates that the effluent from those septic systems will travel. And you can see there are a lot of convergence points that become kind of hotspots where many lines flow together. The green marked areas are parcels owned by the HOA. The green pinstripes are government parcels, and then you see the water bodies marked in blue. So, like I said, we have this for every community along the river. Here's Chartwell across the river in Severn Park. And again, you can see very clearly the hot spots, and they tend to converge at water bodies. These are tending to converge at the creek that runs through the community's golf course. And we have maps like this for all of the waterfront communities on the river. And we have been in touch with all of them to try and work out the logistics of sampling the groundwater in these hotspot areas to ascertain whether this modeling exercise is accurate and whether the concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus pollution in the groundwater that we would expect from septic system effluent is actually present. If we find that it is, then the next approach will be to build a permeable reactive barrier, as the title of these slides indicates. So what is a permeable reactive barrier? This is a diagram that shows the basic concept. On the left, you have contaminated groundwater coming from the septic system of this nice little red house. And then there's the permeable reactive barrier, which is an underground trench that is filled with the medium which is most appropriate for the pollution in question. In the case of nitrates, that's simple wood chips. And they form a biotic community that breaks nitrates down into nitrogen gas, which is an inert part of our air that we breathe, before it's able to reach the tidal waters. And then these lines with like black stripes through them are sampling wells that we can put up gradient and down gradient of the practice to measure the reductions in pollution that are realized as the groundwater flows through the PRB. Now, this practice has been used in industrial settings all over the place to deal with things, heavy metals, PCBs, hexavalent chromiums, all sorts of nasty industrial chemicals. It's been used to deal with nitrogen here in Maryland in an ag setting through practices that are commonly known as bioreactors, where you're able to focus all of the runoff from an ag field that might be treated with, say, chicken manure into one area and run it through a high carbon substrate for the same sort of a treatment. It's been used for septic systems, but not in the state of Maryland, up in New England. And some of the academics who've done that include Mr. Ken Foreman, I should say Dr. Ken Foreman, from Woods Hole. And he's the guy who I stole this slide from. But you can see here the nitrate is represented in colors, and the higher concentrations are the warmer colors, and the lower concentrations are the cooler colors. And they've actually measured in micromolar the concentrations before they reach the PRB, which is indicated by this orange rectangle, and then after. And you can see an order of magnitude reduction in the amount of nitrate after it flows through the practice. So this has been proven to work for this exact application in other areas, and it's been proven to work for a similar application here in the Chesapeake region, which is why we're optimistic about its potential for addressing septic system pollution here in the Severn. Now, this is a nice, cool graphic representation, but to me, the proof in the pudding is really this picture. And this is where the PRB was installed. And that section in the middle that's brown is where the algae that you see on either side of it wasn't growing as robustly because it wasn't getting fed the same level of nitrogen. And so you just see the bare irony rocks of the shoreline there for that little stretch of beach. And that's what we would want, because all those algae, as they flow in and out of those are what's washed up on shore, but there's a lot of that in the water itself. And as it breaks down, it causes that eutrophication cycle, which causes dead zones and, makes the water inhospitable to aquatic life. So the permeable reactive barrier project is something that we're really interested in. If you're in a community where we haven't been in touch with you yet and it's something you're interested in, please reach out to us. Getting a hold of decision makers in communities and getting in front of them to do a presentation is not always easy, and we would definitely appreciate whatever assistance we can get there. But we have already installed test wells in the Sherwood Forest community, and we're analyzing the results. We promised the community we'd do a year of monitoring. That year will finish up this spring, and then we will be taking our results back to the community board to talk about a restoration approach. And I'm going to share a video now of the time where we installed the test wells down by their waterfront. So what we're doing down here today is drilling the test wells to indicate the presence or absence of nitrogen pollution in the groundwater here in the Sherwood Forest community at the mouth to the Brewer Pond in Round Bay. We're so pleased to be working with the Sherwood Forest community on this project. Sherwood's been a great partner and a pioneer on so many conservation efforts within the Severn River that it seemed like a natural fit. If we find elevated nitrogen like we're expecting, then we can install a permeable reactive barrier, which is basically a screen underground of wood chips that will denitrify the polluted groundwater and turn it into an inert nitrogen gas. And that way we'll be able to keep nutrient pollution out of the Severn River, reducing algae blooms, fish kills, and all the other problems that the total maximum daily load is designed to prevent. We've contracted with Tidewater Incorporated to drill the test wells because they have the expertise both in terms of the technical aspects of the work and the geology aspects to interpret the sediment samples that we're taking from the surface all the way to 24 feet below the surface. These wells remain in place for a year before we build the permeable reactive barrier so that we can establish a baseline of water quality. We'll be coming back every 3 months to take samples throughout that first year, understand the ambient levels, and that way, if we put a permeable reactive barrier here, we'll be able to assess its efficacy in the long term and quantify the amount of nitrogen we're keeping out of the river. All right, so that's the program. And big thanks to our restoration associate, Molly Boyd. She actually put this video together on the spot using an iPad and a hotspot from her cell phone while we were there on site doing it. It was done by the end of the day. It's a wonderful thing about folks that are a little more tech savvy than me. But that's the approach with the septic system pollution that we're experiencing, that we can intercept at the shoreline, because that's where the pinch point happens as that freshwater septic effluent floats above the heavier salt water, which is in the soil at the shorelines. So that brings us to in the water itself, and what can we do with oysters? Now, we're really proud of our oyster restoration work to date. Since 2018, we planted over 200 million oysters in the river in the form of spat-on shell. Now, most of you probably know, but for those who don't, a spat is a word for a baby oyster that is glommed onto an older oyster shell. Almost all of the restaurants in Annapolis and many throughout the rest of the state and in Virginia participate in a shell recycling program where the oyster shells from their restaurant are recycled and put into above ground tanks, which are about the size of an above ground swimming pool. Oyster larvae are then put in those tanks. They stick or strike onto the shells, and then that commodity is called spat on shell, and it can be used to regrow oysters elsewhere. That is a practice known as remote setting. What we are exploring now is called direct setting. And so to put this in context, the Robert Lee here in this picture is a 72-foot boat owned by the Department of Natural Resources. The pile of oysters on deck of that boat is about the size of a full-size pickup truck and weighs about 300,000 pounds. The cost to bring that many oysters to the Severn River and plant them ranges between $45,000 and $50,000. So you can tell, A, a lot of money is getting invested. B, a lot of material needs to be moved around. And C, you need a lot of people to do this work, to run the barge, to load it at the lab over in Cambridge at Horn Point, to bring it over here, to plant it, to get the boat all cleaned up and brought back to its dock afterwards. It requires a lot of manpower, and it raised the question for us, could we do it cheaper? What if we didn't need to move all the shell and we could just bring the larvae straight to the existing shell already in the river? We didn't know whether it could be done. We didn't know whether we could get money to do it. But we started doing research. We found that direct setting has been done in a scientific experimental way, very small scale. And we found that, well, we knew that there was a potential funding vehicle, the Chesapeake Oyster Innovation Grant that you see a slide of here. This is from a webinar that the Chesapeake Bay Trust put up about this grant, funding up to $10,000. And we thought, well, okay, we can buy several million oyster larvae. We can figure out how to get them down to the water. Can't we? Well, we decided we'd need to try. So we applied. We had a concept. We won the grant, thankfully, and we put our interns to work along with the rest of us. We went literally to the drawing board here, and you can see our interns from the summer of 24, Finn and Annie, working on what would it look like? How would we do it? Where would we put the device? And then building it here out back of the office where I am today, working on their carpentry skills to burnish up their resume along with their scientific oyster restoration experience. And we manufactured this from scratch. Here's Annie after we had bought a typical kind of battery operated pump that you can get at Home Depot. And this is us testing out on the river. There's me looking out to make sure nobody came and stole our secrets. Actually, I was just looking at the boats going by because trying to get this thing to work when the big wakes go by can get a little hairy, and I wanted to make sure that I was able to give people warning to hold on to stuff before we had it clamped to the side of the boat. But you can see we're using commercially available products here and figuring it out as we went. And there were some hiccups. We had to do some field adjustments. You see Finn here working on the boat to fix a hose that wasn't working right. We had to go back to the drawing board once or twice and say, okay, well, it didn't work to have the thing mounted on the side of the boat here. Maybe we'll do it a different way. But ultimately, we were able to get a product that worked where we were able to draw ambient river water up, mix. While we were doing the testing, we weren't just spending a whole bunch of oyster larvae. Before anybody gets concerned, we were using coffee grounds as an approximation because an oyster larvae is about the size of a grain of ground coffee. And I'll show you a video that explains that a little better.
We've got our deployment tool here set up. We've got the
This is our restoration manager Ben.
There, filter, and then the water pump is going to bring the water right into the bucket. and then it will go down and out the tube at the bottom.
So that's a real quick overview of the basics of it. Pull water up, mix it with oyster larvae, and then send it downstream. Now, importantly, we did not send the oysters through the pump because that would have, ground them up in the pump's works. So the oysters were entered into the flow of river water downstream. But an important thing that we did was we didn't just send these oysters off by themselves. We wanted to give them a little bit of motivation first, and I'll explain about that in a minute. But here on the left, you see 10 million oysters. You see Lola, 3 times a million, 3 times a million, 4 times a million. That's 10 million oysters in a cooler on a bag of ice versus this is actually 13 or 14 million, full disclosure, on the deck of the Robert Lee. But just to give you a sense of the scale of the difference in material handling needs that direct setting affords us, I wanted to show these side by side. All right, now here's where you'll see what the oyster larvae look like, and Ben explaining how we're doing this and what the extra little nudge that we're giving the oysters is. And you can hear Sarah narrating that for you.
And now we're putting in L-Dopa to make them want to stick to the substrate. We'll mix that in. We'll throw in some larvae, let it sit so it can marinate.
All right, I'm gonna hand this to you. Guard it with your life. All right, we got a timer, or at least a time.
10 minutes?
What time is it?
11:19.
11:19. We're gonna go for 10 minutes. We're gonna go for
15.
15 minutes. All right. All right. So this is
1 million larvae.
Oh, that's right, 1 million larvae. It is Lola. These are low salinity, wild type. 1 million. There are 3 packages in here. These come from University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, Bourne Point Laboratory.
By the way, we do not have copyright rights for the music you might hear in the background, so just don't go telling the local rock station, please.
They don't look like much, but believe it or not, this is 1 million baby oyster larvae.
Look at those little tiny specks.
Mm-hmm. Yummy. All right, here we go.
Now, the L-Dopa is a neurotransmitter that basically excites the oyster larvae and makes them more inclined to settle and strike on the oyster shells. So we give them 15 minutes.
And now we wait.
And now we wait.
We give them 15 minutes to get all fired up on this L-Dopa. And then in the next video I show you guys, you'll see them, that bucket of material getting poured into the works and deployed down onto the reef. Now you can hear the pump working, and this is pulling up water, and there's Ben getting the last rinse. And it's pulling water from the river and then running it out the other hose on the other side that is weighted down so that it's real close to the bottom, so that all those larvae are just getting ejected down right above the reef. Treated.
Right, we're about done that one, right?
Yep.
Treated with the L-Dopa so that they are more prone to settling down. So the big question now is, and this was all done last summer, the big question now is, well, how many of them are going to live? The reason that the traditional means of oyster restoration has been spat on shell is because spat are larvae which have had a chance to grow for a couple of weeks on a shell that has, that protects them at least from one side. So in order to to determine whether the direct setting approach is going to provide a greater cost benefit than the traditional spat on shell restoration approach. We need to figure out how many of the oysters are surviving. And stay tuned for that, because that's coming up soon. Just this spring, in a couple of months, we're going to dive those reefs and do representative samples to see what their survival rates are. Here is a quick video from last summer where Sarah and our restoration associate Molly were diving the reefs to see what kind of survival rates we had from our spat on shell plantings. And that is a quadrat that Ben is handing to Sarah. Basically a square, and you can see a bag dangling from it. They take the square down, drop it on a part of the reef, use the bag to pull all the oysters out, bring them back aboard, count how many are live, how many are dead, and what different sizes they are to understand different year classes, because there's a fairly standard rate of growth for oysters within the river, so you can tell how old they are based on how big they are. So those are the innovations in restoration that the Severn River Association is pursuing, from the upland to the shoreline to in the water itself. And now, if you guys have any questions, I'd love to hear them. And thank you for your attention. So Sarah, I guess I can turn it over to you for the chat questions.
I don't have any yet. You must have explained everything very well.
Perfect job. Wonderful.
Yes, you get an A plus.
Yeah, are people able to unmute themselves if they wanted to ask something verbally?
I believe so. Yes.
Yes, you can.
Hey, Lynn.
Hi. Are you going to make the recording available anywhere of this?
Yes,
chat?
we'll put it on the website.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
And I'll email everybody who registered, because several people that registered didn't actually log in. So I'll just email it to everybody who registered.
Thanks, Barb. Yeah, Lloyd.
Yeah, Jesse. Been involved with oyster setting a little bit in the past with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. I was wondering if you're concerned about blue catfish or other species that are down there scarfing up your larvae as they come into the water. You know, they're great filter feeders. They really take a lot of what might be deposited by you guys. I was wondering if that's a concern.
It certainly is a concern. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, predation is the main concern we have for the oyster larvae, because they are so vulnerable at that stage. And you're right, you know, any kind of filter feeder, menhaden, a school of menhaden rolling through there could decimate the whole project. We were careful about the time of day. We wanted to make sure that we did it at slack tide so that we would be able to find them again when we go back for our dive, so that, you know, if it were the tide were coming in or going out, it could shift those oyster larvae a couple hundred feet off of what our GPS coordinates indicate is the planting location. But yeah, you know, there's really nothing we can do to control for the presence or absence of predators at a given time. So that's why we want to do our survival analysis, which we're going to do in a couple months here, to see if we can get representative samples indicating survival rates. But even if the survival rate is low and we can fairly infer that predation played a role in that low survival, the approach still has a lot of promise, because the cost differential is enormous. The $10,000 grant that we had paid for a lot of time spent developing the machine. It paid for the materials to get all that stuff. The cost of the larvae themselves, I think it was only about $4,700. So it's a full order of magnitude reduced from the cost to buy spat on shell. And So for that reason alone, we think that there's a lot of promise with this approach, and there are some things that could potentially be done to facilitate greater recruitment. For instance, CBF and we partnered up to the Bay Foundation had gotten a grant to work with Northrop Grumman to test the impact of acoustics of sound of an oyster reef, because oyster reefs make different sound in the water, and they can mimic that with underwater speakers and see whether that facilitates oyster the larval striking on the shells. So we partnered up with them on that project. We're going to be able to compare and contrast whether that makes a difference. It's possible that that could help with increased recruitment. So, but again, you never know when there's a school of menhaden or some blue cats or whatever coming through the area. In a way, an apex predator might actually help us, because it would scare off filter feeders, which might be scooping up the larvae while it's looking for bigger stuff. But those, such is the nature of field science. There's a lot of variables you just can't control for, but we are definitely concerned about it.
Thank you.
You bet.
Anybody else have a question?
Yes, one quick one. The Corps of Engineers has typically indicated that the density of the oyster bed that you're dropping it on is a major factor. Are you dropping this on an existing oyster bed? Hopefully.
Yes. So I mentioned towards the top of the presentation about how the SRA has restored 4 different reef areas in between the bridges. We selected one that had 2 key characteristics. One is high density of existing oysters, and the other was older age classes that hadn't been planted in several years. That way, when we go through, if we find little itty bitties, we know that they are from either our direct setting work or from natural recruitment. Either way, finding oysters fitting that description is good news. But our hypothesis is that the smaller oysters we will find, especially if they're in really high densities, are from our direct larval setting, because the natural recruitment that we've been able to observe happening in the river in the past has been fairly sparse. So if we find a high density of small class oysters, we can fairly safely infer that it is from the direct setting work. But yeah, your point, Lee, is well taken, that high density of existing oysters is vital for survival of the larvae, because they need that elevation from the bottom to escape sedimentation. And of course, they benefit from somewhat clearer water that is ushered in by the adult oysters that are already present. Yeah, Kurt.
So just switching off oysters back to your bioretention project at Georgetown East, are those ponds, could those be integrated into landscaping at a waterfront house to help with nutrient reduction in stormwater as it leaves the yard into the water, adjoining water?
Absolutely. And, absolutely they could, assuming that the topography is favorable for it. I mean, obviously, if you've got a really steep slope straight from the house to the waterfront, it's not going to work as well. But if you've got any kind of, horizontality, if that's really a word, to the waterfront, then it could work. It could work. And especially if there are areas where sheet flow is being concentrated and it could intercept that concentration, that would be ideal. And I don't remember the exact figure, but it's somewhere in the 90th percentiles of shoreline within Anne Arundel County is privately owned. And so if we're going to be making a real dent in treating stormwater runoff in the county, we've got to be able to prevail on private property owners to be putting these sorts of practices in place. And believe me, once the growing season has had a little bit of time this coming growing season, and those plantings that we put in the fall have started to mature and started to throw off some pretty flowers, we are going to be screaming about it from the rooftops to show everybody how these can be both environmentally beneficial and aesthetically pleasant landscape features, because that's what a lot of private property owners are going to be concerned about, and justifiably so. They want to make sure they got something nice to look at when they're, sitting on their porch having a lemonade and looking out at the river. And they want to make sure that if they should choose to sell their property, they don't diminish their curb appeal. And there is ample room to have an overlap of those two interests, where you can serve the environment and you can also make a pretty picture for yourself and for others in the process.
Okay, now if you take that same concept, how about a lot of the stormwater runoff comes from paved surfaces. Could it be used at the edges of paved surfaces where water tends to become standing water before draining into the stormwater management system that drains, unfortunately, right into the bay?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we're doing at our Key Point Giant project. And Kurt, you and I, who live down here on the tips of the Annapolis Neck, this is our local grocery store. Down at the end of Forest Drive, there's a giant shopping center and huge amount of impervious surfaces, like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of parking places. And we are working with the Giant and putting in stormwater infiltration at the downward slope of this parking lot to treat the runoff from it. And this is going to be, I'm so proud of this project for several reasons, but chief among them are probably I go to this grocery store all the time. I'm going to be able to keep a close eye on this one. But also, I know firsthand from when I go on a day where it's crowded and I have to walk across that parking lot in the summer, it gets hot there. And the water that is flowing off of that parking lot is probably plus 90, maybe even plus 100 degrees in the worst circumstances. And rather than sending it out of the storm drain like a super soaker into Back Creek, we're going to be cooling it through the ground, and the evapotranspiration of these plants, which we're going to treat the same way as we did at Georgetown East. And these are areas right now that are just mowed grass and have been for over 30 years since this shopping center was built, doing absolutely nothing for the environment. And we're turning that space into an environmentally beneficial area that will be filled with absorptive evapotranspiring plants that are good pollinator habitat, that cool the stormwater and keep the nutrients out of it. And again, parking lots, how many people have some sort of problem with their car, or even, just normal functioning of their car's exhaust, leaving spent hydrocarbon combustion, depositions on that parking lot. And that's going to be getting flushed into an area where the fungal colonies in there can potentially be eating that petroleum and breaking it down into its molecular components so that we have less petroleum discharge, oil slicks and all the rest of it into Back Creek. I'm really, really excited about this project. But to your point, Kurt, yes, absolutely. If you use that marginal space around paved areas, these practices can collect that stormwater and turn it into something cooler and cleaner before it reaches the river.
Well, we should put a pin in that for the Bay Ridge discussion, because there are areas of standing water along streets that and the stormwater management system in Bay Ridge goes directly into the bay, into the Lake Hogginton and into the bay. So,
yeah, we absolutely have a sidebar on that one for sure.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah, Lloyd.
Yeah, just a quick mention. You're probably familiar with the Department of Public Works is looking into biochar and pros and cons, if you will. We know that we're learning a bit about the widespread application of biochar on agricultural fields and the associated concentrations of PFAS and PFAS. So they're looking into it. And I guess my point is, you might want to be cautious about biochar about its sources and making sure that it's not contaminated itself from as a product of, say, treatment from wastewater treatment plants.
Thank you. Yeah, that is a good tip, and something that we'll certainly look into a little more carefully. The product that we use in Georgetown East is at least marketed as organic. Now, what that means in practice and to what extent that accounts for something like PFAS, I really don't know. But thank you for making that point, and it's a good one. Sarah, what were you saying? We're running out of time or something?
No, Susan asked the question, how much land-based nitrogen is septic versus natural organic runoff?
How much land use nitrogen is septic versus natural? Well, I'm not exactly sure, and I'm sure that that's dependent on a particular area, but countywide, the figure is estimated at about 30% of the nitrogen reaching the river is from septic systems. Now, that is going to be this raises the question of groundwater and surface water dynamics. And so, many of the septic system's effluent will stay in the ground right until it reaches a seep or a spring and feeds into a stream. Some of it might be leaching out of leaching out of a hillside is kind of what a seep is. So it might become surface water before it hits a stream. But, based off of the best available scientific modeling, the estimate is that about a third of the nitrogen reaching the Severn River is from septic systems.
Hi, Jess, can I further my question?
Sure, please.
I'm on the community in Epping Forest and trying to educate the community about getting some sort of stormwater management program on their individual homes. And they say, oh, we're fine. We just put in a new septic, so we don't need to worry. So I think there's a general misconception that just the natural organic from the forest and whatever nitrogen is on the surface and seeping into the ground has an effect on the oxygen content in our rivers. Is that true or not true? It's not just the septics.
Well, no, it's definitely not just the septics. And yes, certainly some of the nitrogen load that's reaching the river is the sort of natural nitrogen load that would always did from time immemorial. The breakdown of leaves and sticks and so on is going to be introducing nitrogen to the system. What is the concern for us now is, that balance has been thrown out of whack by things like synthetic fertilizers, by the abundance of septic systems. We have 240,000 people that live within the watershed of the Severn River, and the vast majority of the waterfront communities with closest proximity to the river are older communities that are built on septic systems. The city of Annapolis has a lot of communities that are on sewer, and there's another couple that are up in the headwaters area by like Pointfield Landing and Veterans Highway and Benfield that are on sewer, that are newer subdivisions. But by and large, and Epping, of course, is one of them, with the communities are on septic systems. Sorry.
Well, also, I mean, the fact that we now have impermeable roads. They used to be sort of gravel or dirt roads. So what the community is doing by just having, these tarred surfaces is hugely impactful because the water is not allowed to perk. It was sort of my understanding that you kind of want things to perk as much as possible.
That's true. Yeah, you want the stormwater to slow down, spread out, and soak in. That's the 3 S's. And but we gotta do all of it. That's why, again, our approach, upland, shoreline, in the water. We need to make cleaner water for the oysters so they can make cleaner water for us, so that we can continue to make cleaner water for them. It's all a holistic picture. So, certainly your neighbors that upgrade their septic systems deserve to be applauded for that. But, that doesn't mean that they go ahead and then over apply fertilizer to your rose garden,
or pave their whole lawn.
Sure. And anything and everything that we can be doing on our private property is important to be doing.
Thank you.
You bet. All right, well, we have reached our hour. Thank you guys so much for joining us for this inaugural Severnside chat. I'm looking forward to the rest of them. I hope that you all tune in and encourage your friends and neighbors to do the same, and we'll see you next time.